In this segment of labor supply, we're going to begin to consider budget and utility. And for those of you that are familiar with microeconomics and consumer utility or budget optimization, it's going to be very similar, if not identical, to that relationship. For those of you that are not, well, you're about to become familiar with it. So as we think about this, let's first look at budget as a function of money and leisure. And then we'll consider something referred to as an indifference curve. We'll talk about the nature or requirements of indifference curves. And then we'll look at constrained optimization, or something that we think of as a balance condition. That's a big term, constrained optimization, but it'll mean something here in a few minutes. First, let's think about our budget. Our budget is this labor-leisure trade-off line that is informed by some wage rate. But if you think about it, the slope of this budget line is our wage rate, or it's also our overall wage for the day in this case, so really our income for the day divided by the number by leisure hours. So this becomes the slope of this line, and if we have a wage of 20 and leisure hours of 8, then we are at some point on this line at 160, where we have 8 and 160. And we also had 8 hours of labor to get there, of course. So that informs us of some point on this line. We know that the slope of this line is the wage at 20. And I don't want this to confuse you, as I've used W as the variable here. This is the wage. It's not the per unit wage. It's the wages for the entire day. I could have just as easily said that it was the income for the day divided by leisure. It's going to be the same relationship. So don't let that W confuse you. So this is our budget line, and we know that our budget line is simply going to have a slope of 20, which is going to be our income, or our wage for the whole day, divided by our leisure hours, which is, in this case, we have 160 divided by 8 leaves us 20, which is the same 20. So this informs us, this relationship informs us of the slope of this budget line. And this is no different than us having said that this is the hourly wage. Okay, so if that's the budget line, I can either earn 0 in a day and have 16 hours of leisure, or in this case, I can earn $320 in a day and have 0 hours of leisure by having had 16 hours of labor, or I can have some combination of them based upon my opportunities or based upon my need. And in this case, let's assume that the individual has a need of $160 a day, and if they're earning $20, then they are working 8 and at leisure for 8. Well, that's pretty simple to us. That's probably fairly easy to understand. Let's talk now about the concept of utility and the indifference curve. We're using the same wages, income versus labor and leisure relation here. And this downward sloping convex curve is referred to as an indifference curve. Well, let's think about the nature of indifference curves. On an indifference curve, we know that the consumer is indifferent depending upon where they are on this curve. They don't care if they're here or here or here, etc. In each case, they receive utility level 1. So some happiness, some satisfaction level 1. They receive that at any point here, which could be a combination of wage and leisure like this, or a combination of wages and leisure like this. They have the same level of happiness. Well, if we think about that, then the slope of this has to do with some marginal utility they receive from this daily set of wages or income, divided by the marginal utility they've received from this leisure that they are able to obtain. So that's going to give us the slope of the indifference curve. It's always going to be downward sloping. It's always going to be convex. And a couple of other things that are important about indifference curves is that they don't transect So an indifference curve would always run parallel at any point to another indifference curve. And as we go from one indifference curve out to the right to another, we have increased the level of utility. We're going from happiness level 1 to happiness level 2. And you can see that if we get our happiness from some combination of income and leisure, if we've increased our leisure hours, but at the same daily income, we are happier because we have more leisure hours. That makes us happier. We have the same amount of wage. The wage part of that left us equally as happy. Or if we increase our wages but maintain a constant number of leisure hours, again, that gives us greater happiness, so we've moved out and to the right. So we know that as these curves move out and to the right, they are a greater level of utility. We know that as being called an indifference curve, at any point that the individual might be able to arrive on this curve, any combination of income and leisure that would take us to a point on this curve, any point is going to be similar in happiness, so we're indifferent to it. So they're parallel to each other, downward sloping, convex. I indicated that they don't actually transect one another, which means they also never run tangent to another. Let me explain that briefly. Let's assume we had an indifference curve that looked like this, and we were trying to call this U3, so more happiness than U2. Well, it doesn't make sense for this to have transected, because here we might be saying that this consumer or this worker receives happiness level 3 by having a lesser wage and income and leisure hour combination than happiness level 2 gave them. So they would have more happiness from less leisure. That doesn't make sense to us. And so we can't have that relationship. That can't exist. It would have to look like this. It would have to look like this. Oh, now it disappears. So they can't transect. They also can't touch for the same reason. So these are just some of the rules of indifference curves. And if you think about it, this is going to be informed by some marginal utility that we get from this income and wage, and divided by the marginal utility that we get from leisure. So the slope of this is going to be whatever this value is. And marginal utility is a little bit ethereal for us at the moment. Unless you're familiar with microeconomics or sociology, you probably don't understand how we would necessarily measure marginal utility. I don't want to worry about that right at the moment. Just know that we get some utility or happiness from each of these two goods, leisure and wages, and that the slope of this line is going to be the marginal utility of wage income divided by the marginal utility of leisure. Well, if we think about it, we want to get to a point where our budget equals our indifference curve or our marginal utility relationship. And this is referred to as constrained optimization. So why don't we look for higher levels of utility? Well, we do look for them. We'd love to be at U2 or at U3 instead of at U1, because that means we're happier, we're more satisfied, but we simply can't afford them based upon the wage that we're receiving, the income that generates, and this budget line that we have. Well, this constrained optimization is where the budget line is equal to the indifference curve. The budget line is equal to the indifference curve right here. And so in this case, if that is where we have become equal, and if this is at 160 and 8, as I've suggested it would be, this would mean that this particular consumer, this particular worker, receives their greatest level of happiness achievable by their budget when they are at 8 hours of leisure receiving $160 of income for the day, which is the same thing as being at 8 hours of labor. It's conceivable that a different consumer with different preferences, different needs for income, different preferences for leisure might have a different indifference curve. Maybe it even looks like this. So this would be U for some different consumer or worker, in which case this person perhaps would be happiest at a $200 daily budget, 6 hours of leisure, and 10 hours of labor. But this, you will not have the same worker or same consumer having indifference curves as U delta and U1 because they've crossed each other. They don't make sense. So for one consumer, you can't have both of those relationships. You would have to restrain this to those that are downward sloping, convex, never crossing. And this leads us to this balance condition. So we want to have a balance between our utility and our budget, and that balance is arrived when they are equal to each other. And we have this balance condition in microeconomics, and really labor economics is nothing but a microeconomics story applied. And if you think about it, this balance condition is the same as this constrained optimization because all I have done is rearrange my variables. Let me go from the balance condition back to the constrained optimization condition, and you can very easily see how they're the same relationship. I will go ahead now and say I've got the marginal utility of my wage income, and I'm going to divide this part of the equation by marginal utility of leisure income. So marginal utility of leisure income, marginal utility of leisure income means that that disappears. So I can then think of marginal utility of leisure here divided by the marginal utility of wage. And now I'm going to go ahead and multiply both sides of my equation by wage. So I'm multiplying and I'm multiplying, so it disappears here, and I end up with wage over my leisure, which is the same equation as we have right here, only it's reversed. So the constrained optimization condition is where we have our utility curve, our indifference curve, equal to or tangent, directly tangent to our budget curve. And we know this because of this somewhat quintessential relationship in microeconomics called the balance condition that we tend to like to hold ourselves to. And we know that we're going to want to always be at the highest level of happiness that we can be at given our budget. Well, why would we not be satisfied by being on U0? Well, we wouldn't be satisfied by being on U0 because to be on U0, we're at some lesser wage and some lesser hours of leisure. And if we get happiness from wage income and leisure time, to have less of both of them will make us less happy. Why would we be satisfied with that when we could be at U1 instead of U0? So we want the greatest happiness based upon our budget, and that's when the constrained optimization and balance condition are both met.